Can I start?
Yep.
Okay, so the paper that I have chosen is called 8 Policies and Growth by Craig Burnside and David Dollar from the Policy Research Department of the World Bank. So first of all, let's take a look at this. Enormous and steady flows of concessional external finance from developed countries have permitted third world governments to pursue, quoted, development policies that have been wasteful, ill-conceived, unproductive, or even positively destructive. So when we see claims like this, when we think of the fact that we have spent the last 40 years talking about underdeveloped countries or developing countries, while they have been receiving foreign aid, and that maybe we have not accomplished the goals that we were supposed to accomplish, we may think that something has been wrong. We get to this classic question in economics: does foreign aid really has an impact on growth? So the reason why I chose this paper is because I like this classic question, but I think that it's not only a classic, but something that is still important. And I like this paper in particular because it is innovative. Unlike other past literature, it includes economic policies into the equation. And it goes beyond that. It does not only want to know whether foreign aid has an effect on growth or not, but it also wants to know whether these good policies have an impact on aid or not. So the authors expect aid to have a positive impact on growth, but furthermore, they expect good policy to make aid more effective, and they expect policies and aid to influence each other. So first of all, I'm going to explain you where do these expectations come from. I'm going to talk about the neoclassical growth model. And secondly, I'm going to talk about the growth model that these authors are going to use for their regressions. And we're going to see two different regressions. In the first one, aid and policies are considered as exogenous. And in the second one, aid and policies have endogeneity. So we're going to see that when we consider how aid and policies relate, we're going to have a different measure on the effect that aid has on growth in general. So before seeing the neoclassical growth model, I'm going to talk about the data that they use. There is a database made by the World Bank, which covers the period from the 1970s to 1993, and it includes 56 countries. Of course, 21 of them are African because they are the major aid recipients, and they also include other countries such as Argentina, Chile, or Brazil, because these middle-income countries have a different approach to aid. Aid is allocated in a different way, and they are also going to be useful. I will explain later. So, what does this neoclassical model say? First of all, it will give us three main insights. First of all, it says that poor countries should have a high return to capital and a fast growth rate when they are in the transition to the steady state. So developing countries would be there. You can see that the growth rate is much higher than if we were here in a developed country. But although aid is supposed to accelerate this transition, this is not always the case because we may have some institutional and policy distortion, which may lower the return to capital, and thus the growth will be slower than we expected. Secondly, they expect aid to have a good impact on the income level and to break this that they call the poverty trap. This term is not in this paper, but some other authors, like Jeffrey Sachs, have mentioned this circle as the poverty trap. And well, what we find here is that since these underdeveloped countries are in a situation of subsistence, they do not have marginal income, so they cannot accumulate capital, and they cannot reinvest the capital that they accumulate in other economic activities, so they grow very slowly. Aid is supposed to rise the marginal income so that we accumulate capital and we can break this trend. And the third insight is that, as we have seen during the course, if we have distortionary taxes, if we do not use lump sum taxes, we're going to have an economy which performs poorly, and in this case, even though we are sending foreign aid, it will be less effective if we have these taxes. And we have to be aware of two things. So the expectations on the effects of aid on growth are based on this model, but it does not take some things into account. For instance, aid is not given lump sum. So if I link aid to the income of a country, I'm kind of creating an effect which would be similar to a tax on capital accumulation. This means that if I give aid depending on the income that the country has, I'm saying, okay, you have a high income, you're going to receive less aid. So, in a sense, it's like I would be taxing the capital accumulation. So if the impact of aid is no greater than the impact of the tax effect, we would be doing harm rather than helping with the aid. And the second insight to take into account here is that we are considering that the model would lead to a social optimum, but this might not be the case because, for instance, we would have to assume that we have a benevolent social planner, and unfortunately, we know that politicians do not have the same incentives as a benevolent social planner would have. So the positive impact predicted by the model is likely to be smaller in conclusion. And we get to the part of the econometrics, the growth equation. So what do? In order to make the regressions, they make an equation in which the dependent variable is the growth rate of real GDP per capita, and independent variables include the initial income of the countries, institutional and political variables, economic policies, aid, and as it says there, aid interacted with policies. So I'm going to talk about good policies for a while, and you may be wondering, well, okay, but what is good policies? What do you consider good policies? So I took some examples from the paper. The security of property rights and the efficiency of the government bureaucracy should have a good effect on aid, a good impact. But, for instance, ethnic fractionalization is known to lead to poor growth because the authors find it in past literature. The number of assassinations which measures civil unrest should be low because otherwise civil unrest would lead also to economic instability. And the authors also say that there shouldn't be monetary distortions, that money supply should not be like manipulated too much. That would be a bad policy. So in the first regression, they take aid and growth as exogenous, and that is like the classical way of studying aid, or that was the classical way of studying this question until they decided to introduce endogeneity. So if we consider that aid and growth are exogenous, we would obtain this result. On average, aid has little impact on growth. But these authors strongly believe that aid and policies are correlated in some way, that they affect each other, and they are going to take them as endogenous. Why? Because they interact in some way. They make a series of observations. For instance, they wonder how aid is allocated, and when they take a look at the allocation of aid, they see, for instance, that there is an inverse relationship with income. This is linked to the example of the tax on the accumulation of capital. Aid is not given lump sum, so politicians decide the amount of aid depending on the income of the recipient country. Also, it is known that middle-income countries receive more aid if they are armed producers. So, this is a matter of politics. It's just statistics. I mean, it's a fact. The middle-income countries which produce guns, they used to receive more aid. When I talked about the database, I said that they introduced it to middle-income countries, and maybe you wonder why middle-income countries should be there. And I said that they are useful in order to see the allocation of aid. So you can see now why they did it. For instance, another fact that proves that aid is in a way related with policies is the World Bank and the IMF programs. They promoted some programs in South Africa, in Latin America, and in some parts of Asia, and they established a series of conditions in order to receive the aid. So you have to, let's say, have a concrete system of taxation, and on the other hand, you should avoid high inflation. And there are other policies that do not matter a lot, like budget surplus. So the conclusion that they obtain from this is that the donors have made some effort to reward good policy, but they have other interests as well. Independently of whether they reward good policy or not, what we know is that aid and policies are related in some way, and that it makes more sense to take them as endogenous when measuring the effects of aid on growth. So they make the regression with different kinds of aid. First of all, they start with bilateral aid, and they find that there is no correlation between the aid that these countries receive and their policies. On average, they receive the same level of assistance independently of the policies that they promote. But in the case of multilateral and World Bank aid, they find that the correlation with policy is positive and is quite strong. So in the case when the countries come together to decide a program of aid, they care about the policies that the recipient countries are having, and this is very common in the World Bank. As I said, they design a program for the recipient country in order to give them that aid. So does aid promote good or bad policies? Well, it is insignificant because, as they said previously, aid is given and sometimes it's intended to promote good policies, but sometimes not, because they do not have a systematic way of allocating aid. So donors, in a sense, are inconsistent when delivering aid. But the most important part of this paper is the following conclusion. Even though aid might not promote good or bad policies, good policies do have an effect on aid. And that is the main discovery that these authors did. Because when they made this regression, when aid and policies are endogenous, they found robust evidence that aid has a positive effect. So aid is positive, providing that it is given in an environment of good fiscal, monetary, and trade policies. Otherwise, it doesn't matter if you're sending vast flows of aid. If the policies do not help, it is not going to work. It will have a very little impact. So they say that when good policy and aid have happened to coincide, aid is much more effective. So they conclude that aid should be given to good policy performers, that there should be more effort put on allocating aid correctly. And I leave you with this reflection that they make. They say that the climate for effective aid is improving, while the amount of aid diminishes. Well, I think that we all may have a different opinion on aid. Personally, when I decided to study international studies in economics, which is the bachelor that I studied in Spain, I imagined myself as somebody maybe working in the UN or somebody involved in some kind of aid program. And when I started reading about this and seeing the economic effects that aid has had, I was really disappointed, because I think that there are lots of lies surrounding aid, and that even when aid is granted with good intentions, sometimes intentions are not the most important part, because we care about results. Economics should always be about results and not about good intentions. As Luis explained regarding her paper, sometimes you think that some kind of policy will be the best one, and in the end it ends up breaking the whole economic system. I think that there are other alternatives to aid, and I have checked some cases. For instance, Botswana is a country in sub-Saharan Africa surrounded by countries who have received a lot of aid and which have been a failure. And it's an example that you can really develop if you trust in a free market, if you protect private property, and if you just do not fall in a trap of having a very big debt because of aid, because aid is not free. So we should really think about this, and we should really think that there may be other alternatives and maybe promote them, because this is not working as it should have. Thank you. So if you have any questions?
Yes. So as far as I understood, the aid does not affect policy in a good sense. And do they give any explanation? We didn't get why, or is it just the result?
What they say is that there is inconsistency. So some countries are more willing to promote good policies by allocating aid, giving the aid to those countries which have concrete programs of economic reforms, protection of private property, functioning institutions, and etc. But other countries, they just don't mind. We have to take into account that when a donor is providing aid, the donor is, in a sense, in a way, is exporting something. And they usually have interests on exporting a concrete thing under below market price, and they don't care whether the recipient is going to have a concrete policy or not. They care about exporting that, earning their money, and maybe having even some political influence with the recipient country, because aid started in the Cold War and it was a tool for political influence. They do not always allocate aid in a systematic way, and that is why they say that the effect of that aid has on policies is insignificant. The correlation is close to zero, because it depends on the criteria of each country, and they do not allocate it in a systematic way.